Thousands of years ago, a person stood alone in the middle of an open field. No fire, no shelter, just an enormous darkness stretching overhead, and thousands of glittering points of light pouring down from it. What do you think ran through that person's mind? Did they simply think, "Oh, how beautiful"? No. They saw faces in those lights. A giant with arms raised toward the sky. A princess bound in chains. A hero enduring endless suffering, refusing to fall. For thousands of years, people have looked up at the night sky, not as a random collection of lights, but as a living stage where stories breathe and move. A stage built for the greatest tales ever told. And that brings me to a question I want to ask you today. Why did ancient people trace the shapes of heroes into the stars? Was it pure coincidence? Or was the night sky humanity's very first great story, written in light? That is exactly what we are exploring today. This is not about astrology. It is not a stargazing guide. This is about the living dramas of heroes, woven into the sky by thousands of years of human imagination and feeling. And if you stay with me until the end, I promise the night sky will never look quite the same to you again. Let's start with the most fundamental question of all. How did constellations come to exist? And why? About 5,000 years ago, the people of Mesopotamia began systematically recording the stars for the first time. In the land that is now modern Iraq, priests of Sumer and Babylon climbed to the tops of open-air temples every night to study the sky, but they were not there to admire the view. To them, the stars were a calendar. They were signals telling farmers when to plant their seeds. They were warnings that rivers were about to flood. When Orion rose in the eastern sky, winter had arrived. When the Pleiades appeared, it was time to set sail. Farmers and fishermen, merchants and navigators, everyone needed to learn how to read the night sky. Then something remarkable happened. Human beings are not built to be satisfied with a simple grid of dots. People began drawing lines between the stars. Those lines became shapes, and those shapes became stories. When Greek civilization entered the picture, those stories exploded into something extraordinary. In the 3rd century BCE, the Greek poet Heracles wove together 44 constellations and their myths into a single epic poem called The Phenomena. It was so influential that the Roman statesman Cicero translated it into Latin himself. Then, in the 2nd century CE, the astronomer Ptolemy formally catalogued 48 constellations in his work, the Almagest, laying the foundation for the star system we still use today. At its core, creating constellations was humanity's way of naming the vast, cold universe in a language of their own. That cluster of stars over there, that is a great hunter. Those ones? An innocent princess, wrongly condemned. And that brilliant pattern? An immortal hero who survived 12 impossible trials. The night sky became humanity's first storybook. And today, I want to share with you the 3 most dramatic stories written in those stars. The first story belongs to the most prominent figure in the winter night sky. The legend of Orion, the giant hunter. There are several versions of Orion's myth, but the most widely known begins like this. He was born the son of Poseidon, god of the sea, and he inherited his father's power in every sense of the word. He stood far taller than any ordinary man, and no human alive could match him in strength or speed. He was a hunter. Not just any hunter. The greatest hunter the world had ever seen. No creature in any forest could survive his pursuit, and no prey could escape his arrow. He traveled with just 2 hunting dogs at his side, Canis Major and Canis Minor, and both would later join him in the sky as constellations of their own. But Orion had one fatal flaw: his pride. Greek mythology returns to this pattern again and again with a kind of relentless honesty. When someone of extraordinary ability becomes intoxicated by that ability, things fall apart. One day, Orion made a declaration: "I will hunt every creature on this earth." In some versions of the myth, he said this directly to Artemis, goddess of the hunt and the moon. It was the kind of boast that crossed a line, a claim that all life on Earth existed simply as his prey. That declaration reached the ears of Gaia, the goddess of the Earth itself. To a being who nurtures and holds every living thing, a vow to destroy all life was an act of war. Gaia called forth a scorpion from deep within the Earth, armored with a hard shell and armed with a lethal sting. It was not a creature that could easily be overpowered. The clash between Orion and the scorpion was not just a fight. It was a collision between human arrogance and the natural order of things. Orion fought with everything he had, but in the end, he lost. When the news reached Artemis, she was overcome with grief. Some versions of the myth say she had grown deeply fond of Orion, perhaps even loved him. Heartbroken, she turned to her brother Apollo, and together, they pleaded with Zeus to honor Orion by placing him among the stars. Zeus agreed, and Orion became a constellation that shines forever in the night sky. But the myth adds one final detail. The scorpion, too, was honored for its valor and placed among the stars. Yet Zeus made sure the two would never face each other again. Orion rules the winter sky. The scorpion, Scorpius, rules the summer sky. The two constellations sit on opposite sides of the sky, and they are never visible at the same time. Whether the ancient Greeks knew this astronomical fact before they built the myth, or whether the myth simply happened to align with it, we cannot say. But one thing is certain. The next time you find Orion on a winter night, you will be carrying with you a story that has been told for thousands of years. The story of a great hunter who forgot, where greatness ends and arrogance begins. So what does Orion's story actually say to us? It says that ability is not the same as permission. Being capable of something does not mean you have the right to do it. And no matter how far a person rises, the desire to claim everything as your own will eventually pull you down. The Greeks carved that lesson into the sky so no one would ever forget it. The second story brings us to another part of the sky. Near Orion, visible on autumn nights, lies the constellation Andromeda. It is the story of a princess who became a victim of someone else's pride and the hero who arrived just in time to save her. In the kingdom of Ethiopia, there lived a queen named Cassiopeia. She had a daughter named Andromeda, whose beauty was said to be unlike anything found anywhere in the kingdom, or perhaps anywhere in the world. Cassiopeia was enormously proud of her daughter, and honestly, what mother wouldn't be? But Cassiopeia's pride went too far. She declared openly and without hesitation that her daughter, Andromeda, was more beautiful than the Nereids, the sea nymphs beloved by Poseidon himself. Claiming that a mortal girl outshone divine beings was not just a compliment. In the world of Greek myth, it was a provocation. Poseidon's response was swift and devastating. He sent massive waves crashing over the coasts of Ethiopia and unleashed a sea monster called Cetus to terrorize the kingdom. Cetus is described in the myth as an enormous creature, part whale, part serpent, part nightmare. No ship that entered those waters returned, and the coastal villages lived in constant terror. King Cepheus sought an oracle. How could this nightmare be stopped? The answer was brutal. His daughter Andromeda had to be offered up as a sacrifice. The price for the queen's arrogance would be paid, not by the queen herself, but by her innocent daughter. And this is the moment where the myth earns its power. Because Andromeda had done nothing wrong. She had never boasted about her own beauty. She had never challenged the gods. She was simply the daughter of a woman who spoke without thinking, and now she was the one paying the price. Is that fair? No, it is deeply unfair. And Greek mythology knew that too. It never pretended the world was always just. So Andromeda was chained to a rocky cliff by the sea. Somewhere in the distance, Cetus was coming. The sound of the ocean would have mixed with something far more terrifying. And yet, in that darkest moment, she had not given up hope. The Greeks imagined that scene and passed it down through generations because it speaks to something universally human. Then, from high above, something came streaking across the sky. It was Perseus. He was returning from his encounter with the monster Medusa, the winged sandals gifted by Hermes, carrying him through the air. From above, he spotted Andromeda chained to the cliff below. Perseus acted immediately. He went to King Cepheus and made his offer plainly. "If I save the princess, I ask for her hand in marriage." The king agreed. When Cetus rose from the waves, Perseus drew out the head of Medusa and turned the monster to stone. The enormous form sank beneath the water. The sea grew calm. Andromeda was free. But the story does not end there. Andromeda had already been promised to another man, a man named Phineus. When Cetus came, Phineus had not stepped forward to save her. Yet the moment Perseus had done it, Phineus showed up at the wedding, demanding she be returned to him. It is one of those details in mythology that feels uncomfortably familiar. Someone who is absent in the moment of crisis, suddenly asserting their claim once the crisis is past. Perseus and Andromeda married and built a life together. When they died, both were placed among the stars. And today, if you look at the night sky, Andromeda's constellation sits surrounded by Perseus, Cassiopeia, Cepheus, and even Cetus nearby. An entire family's story, clustered together in the same corner of the sky. And in that same direction, there is something even more astonishing. The Andromeda Galaxy, the largest galaxy, near our own Milky Way, sits right there, about 2.5 million light-years away. On a clear night, far from city lights, you can actually see it with the naked eye, a faint smudge of ancient light. Whether the Greeks placed a princess's story in that particular direction by chance, or whether something about that distant glow whispered a different kind of story to them, we will never know. But the fact alone is enough to stop you in your tracks. What Andromeda's myth wants us to understand is something a little different from Orion's. The world sometimes places suffering on people who do not deserve it. One person's mistake falls on someone else's shoulders. That is not a story from ancient times. It happens today. But even in the middle of that kind of pain, rescue can arrive from the most unexpected direction. And it tends to come at the moment when everything seems completely lost. The Greeks built that hope into the stars. The third and final story today is perhaps the most famous and most heartbreaking of all Greek myths. It is the story behind the constellation Hercules, the story of Heracles himself. Heracles was the son of Zeus and a mortal woman named Alcmene, which made him half human, half divine. His very birth carried the seeds of tragedy. Hera, queen of the gods and wife of Zeus, saw Heracles as a living reminder of her husband's betrayal, and she made him her enemy from the moment he entered the world. When he was still an infant, she sent 2 serpents into his crib. The baby Heracles overpowered them both with astonishing strength. That famous scene tells us 2 things at once: that he was extraordinary from the start, and that his entire life would be defined by struggle against a force that wanted him to fail. As he grew up, Heracles trained under the finest teachers of his time. He studied music, strategy, wrestling, and archery. By the time he reached adulthood, he was without question the greatest warrior in the human world. He married a princess of Thebes named Megara, had children, and for a time lived something close to a happy life. But Hera's hatred did not rest. She struck Heracles with a kind of madness, a total collapse of reason. In that dark and fractured state of mind, he brought an irreversible tragedy upon those he loved most. When his clarity returned, the weight of what he had done crushed him. The strongest man in the world was suddenly carrying the heaviest grief imaginable. I want to pause here for a moment, because this is the part that makes the myth so enduring. Why did the Greeks give their greatest hero the deepest internal wound? External enemies can be defeated, no matter how powerful they are, but a tragedy born from within, a loss that cannot be undone, is something no weapon can touch. Even the strongest person alive can be broken by guilt and grief. Heracles' story is asking a quiet but relentless question. What does real strength actually look like? And it answers by showing us that pain does not spare anyone, not even the mightiest among us. Seeking redemption, Heracles traveled to the oracle at Delphi. The oracle commanded him to serve King Eurystheus of Tiryns and complete 12 labors. Eurystheus was no friend to Heracles, and the labors were designed from the start to be impossible. Some were meant to destroy him, but Heracles completed them, one by one. The first was the Nemean lion, a creature whose hide could not be pierced by any weapon. Heracles brought it down with his bare hands, and its golden pelt became his iconic symbol. The second was the Lernaean hydra, a monster that grew back stronger each time it was cut. With the help of his nephew Aeolus, who sealed each wound with fire. Before new heads could grow, Heracles finally defeated it. The third was the Cyrenian hind, a golden antlered deer sacred to Artemis. Heracles tracked it for an entire year before capturing it, without causing it any harm. The fourth was the Erymanthian boar. The fifth was cleaning the Augean stables. 30 years of filth, accumulated from thousands of cattle, cleared in a single day by rerouting 2 rivers straight through them. The sixth were the Stymphalian birds. The seventh, the Cretan bull. The eighth, the wild and fearsome mares of Diomedes. The ninth, the belt of Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons. The 10th, the cattle of the giant Geryon. The 11th, the golden apples of the Hesperides, where Heracles briefly took on Atlas's burden of holding up the sky, then used a clever trick to get Atlas to take it back. And the 12th, the most daunting of all, descending into the underworld and bringing back Cerberus, the 3-headed guardian of the dead. Using no weapons, Heracles succeeded, stood before Eurystheus with Cerberus at his side, and the 12 labors were complete. But his suffering did not end there. The myth is clear that life after the labors was not peaceful, and his final chapter arrived as a tragedy. His wife, Deianira, acting out of love, but acting on a lie, gave him a garment that had been tainted by the dying breath of the centaur Nessus. When Heracles put it on, it caused him a pain that would not stop. The strongest being in the human world was now helpless in a way no battle had ever made him. Heracles made his peace with the end that had come for him. Some read this as his final act of acceptance, a decision to meet his fate on his own terms, rather than let it drag him down. And then the myth takes a turn that feels almost like grace. According to the story, his mortal suffering ended, and something divine was born in its place. Zeus called his spirit up to Olympus with a thunderbolt. Even Hera, who had been his enemy since birth, finally made her peace with him. Heracles was welcomed among the gods, married Hebe, and received the immortality that had always, in some way, been waiting for him. And in the night sky, the constellation Hercules was placed as the enduring symbol of everything he went through. One knee bent, one hand raised with a club, the other gripping a serpent. Why has Heracles moved people for thousands of years? Because he was not a perfect hero. He raged. He made devastating mistakes. He fell apart completely. But he chose to face what he had done. He chose the long, painful road of making things right. His greatness was not built on strength alone. It was built on what he did after he lost everything. That is why his story lasts. Now we have heard all three. Orion, the great hunter, undone by his own pride. Andromeda, the innocent princess who suffered for someone else's mistake and was rescued against all odds. And Heracles, who walked through guilt and grief and impossible trials and came out the other side as something more than human. When you look at all three together, a common thread runs through them. Every one of these heroes wrestles with the most fundamental human emotions: pride and its consequences, injustice and the possibility of rescue, guilt and the long road of redemption, pain and what lies beyond it. These feelings belong to the Greeks thousands of years ago, but they also belong to every one of us right now. Some people dismiss Greek mythology as old stories with no modern relevance, but these myths keep coming back. In films, novels, video games, paintings, and sculptures, they keep returning because they hit something deep and honest in human nature that does not change with time. Orion's pride repeats itself every day in the modern world. The moment someone with real talent starts to believe that talent justifies everything, the same story begins playing out. Andromeda's injustice is still happening. People are still suffering from mistakes they did not make. And the hope that rescue can arrive from somewhere unexpected is still one of the things that keeps people going. Heracles' path of redemption is still the hardest and most necessary journey a person can take. Facing what you have done, accepting the weight of it, and choosing to move forward anyway. That is what the myth calls heroism. The Greeks did not just record these stories in books or carve them into temples. They put them in the sky, in the one place that has always been open to everyone. A farmer who could not read, a sailor crossing an ocean alone at night, a child lying in a field, just looking up. All of them could see the same sky and carry the same stories. That is why the Constellations are humanity's oldest museum. Constellations were the starting point of astronomy. But more fundamentally than that, they were the oldest language human beings ever invented for passing down their experiences, their emotions, and their hard-won lessons to the people who would come after them. Centuries passed. City lights began to drown out the darkness. But those stories are still up there, exactly where they were left.
Tonight, if you find yourself somewhere under an open sky, I hope you remember that those points of light are not just light. Up there is a proud giant who learned the cost of thinking he owned the world. A princess who bore a punishment she never deserved and was saved when it seemed impossible. A hero who broke completely and chose again and again to get back up. And if you look long enough, you might find something else in those stories. A reflection of yourself, because we are all sometimes arrogant. We are all sometimes the victim of something unfair. We are all sometimes crushed by something we cannot undo. And we all, in our own way, take the next step anyway. That step is not so different from the ones these heroes took thousands of years ago, written in stars that are still shining. When you look up at the night sky now, can you hear them? The struggles and the triumphs of heroes, playing out just above your head? Maybe their stories are not so far from your own. These three myths are, at their heart, a record of the most essential human experiences: pride and its cost, injustice, and the hope of rescue, guilt, and the courage to begin again. The constellations are not just star patterns. They are the oldest messages ever sent, written in light by people who wanted the generations that came after them to know. We felt this too, and we found a way through.
That is everything for today's video. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. Next time, we are going back into the night sky to explore a different kind of legend. We will be looking at the mythological animals written into the stars and the extraordinary stories behind why each one was placed there. The human meaning hidden inside those creatures might surprise you. If you want to be there for that one, subscribing and hitting like are the best way to make sure you don't miss it. See you in the next one.